Hello and welcome to Under the Super Scope, where we take a look at some of the most famous games of all time and try to work out if they still hold up today. And this time we're taking a look at one of the most ambitious Smash games in the series, but also one that's polarizing to a lot of players. Of course, look at the title, it's Super Smash Bros. Brawl. Now let's take a step back. Melee was developed in just 13 months, which is utterly ridiculous for a game like Super Smash Bros. And while the rush development certainly shows, it enabled the game to be something different to the fighting game community. Perhaps not the intended vision, but a viable way to play Melee nonetheless. Brawl, on the other hand, took just over 2 years to develop and built upon the foundation of Melee. In fact, from here on, the series would continuously use the previous game as a groundwork for development, just because creating an entirely new setup from scratch in such a short time would be a little bonkers. Especially as with crossovers like this, you always need to top yourself. Avengers Infinity War can't have fewer heroes than the first movie, it just wouldn't be as appealing. Melee had a roster of 26, Brawl had 35, well, technically 37. Melee had 29 stages, Brawl had 41. Melee had 60 songs, Brawl had 253. It was a bigger game in just about every respect, and it's evidently a very different game to its predecessor. Some were disappointed with Smash for Wii U and 3DS, as they didn't have an ambitious statement that says, "This is what makes me distinct," whereas Brawl certainly did. There are so many new elements crammed into this game, but even from the outset, you can look at Brawl and look at Melee and just tell these aren't similar looking games. Particularly impressive as the Wii's hardware wasn't all that different to GameCube's. Whether you like them or not, Brawl adopted a realistic visual style, using photorealistic backgrounds and giving characters like Mario dark, lifelike textures. This synergy appeared across the entire roster, which allowed for characters as different as Sonic and Snake to viably appear alongside each other. Personally, I'm not a big fan of the art direction and feel it hasn't aged as well as Melee's more simple style, but it's a key area that makes Brawl feel distinct. It's of course not the only one though. Brawl's entire combat system feels completely overhauled, with the game being slower, more floaty, and generally easier to play. Whether they were intentionally trying to match the Wii's more family-orientated demographic or not, I don't know, but I'd say they passed with flying colours. Smash isn't quite as easy to teach to those who don't generally play games, especially compared to Wii Sports and Mario Kart. But at the same time, it's easier to learn than any other fighter. I mean, if you don't know Street Fighter and Tekken, then you just kind of button mash. In Smash, once you understand the controls for one character, those skills can be extrapolated to another thanks to the unified control scheme. Brawl's slower pace and floatier physics gives those people more of a chance. And with it being the best-selling game in the series at 13.29 million copies, it's safe to say the social circle pushed this game pretty hard. Though it also helps that the console sold over 100 million units. I'm fully aware that a lot of people don't like the fundamentals of Brawl's fighting, and we'll of course get deeper into that, but being slower isn't inherently bad. It just means it's not a game for people who went deeper into Melee's mechanics. The series would go on to form something of a middle ground. Ultimate's certainly a much faster game than Brawl, but the team didn't necessarily look back at Melee to accomplish this. Brawl's DNA undoubtedly stuck with the series, and was a key stepping stone in making Smash more accessible. After all, that was the entire point of Smash to begin with, to be a fun, accessible party fighter. But that's not to say that Brawl's balanced. One of Melee's biggest problems is half the roster just isn't fun to play as because the other half is just so much better. Comparatively, Brawl has a much nicer chunk of enjoyable characters, and it really did a great job of making most of the roster viable, even if there are still a handful who are simply worse, like Samus with their floaty physics and an already floaty game, and Ganondorf who's slower than ever. But where Melee had a Marth problem, Brawl has an even greater problem: Meta Knight. Yeah, Marth can grab you from across the universe, but Meta Knight has an attack that's very hard to interrupt, he can recover like crazy with multiple jumps and even a glide, and he's a viable matchup for pretty much any character in the game. Speaking of gliding, that was something exclusive to a couple of wing characters in Brawl, like Meta Knight, Charizard, and Pit. It's fun to glide around, but my god is it broken for recoveries. You can save yourself from insane circumstances with these characters, probably why it was cut in Smash 4. The Ice Climbers, likewise, have an exploit of being able to continuously chain grab. It's certainly not fair to call Melee broken and then praise Brawl. Both games have characters with tremendous advantages, it's just Brawl has a higher pool to choose from. Variety really is in Brawl's favour, as while Melee was a nearly packed museum of Nintendo, Brawl came along and dwarfed it. 290 trophies? Try 544, and 700 stickers. Try demos for key franchises represented in the roster. Try stages from franchises who aren't even in the roster. There was so much to learn from Brawl, and chances are this was a game where a lot of fans were introduced to games like Kid Icarus. This is where a lot of fans started yearning for Mother 3. This is where a whole generation of children who grew up with the Wii started learning about Nintendo. Brawl enabled so much, not just with the core fighting, but everything surrounding it. And one of the core elements of that was, of course, the Subspace Emissary, the first option that greets you when you choose single player. Now I'm going to preface this before going in too hard. Going from Melee's adventure mode, which only had like 4 side-scrolling levels, to this full-fledged 10-hour single-player campaign is absolutely wild, especially with over an hour's worth of pre-rendered cutscenes. It's essentially a fan dream come true. Though I do feel like we sometimes only attach ourselves to the good parts of Subspace and forget the bad, cause there's quite a lot of bad. Yeah, the cutscene where they all zoom out in ships is awesome. Yeah, the opening makes quite a statement with Kirby trying to save Peach and Zelda from PT Piranha, and that's a sentence I never thought I'd say. But the actual levels have severe pacing issues. It starts off strong, introducing all these subplots that gradually merge together, but there's this lull in the middle where you're bouncing back and forth from the insides of the Halberd, which are basically metal corridors, and the insides of a research facility, which are basically just metal corridors. It's an immensely ambitious mode, but it can also get a little generic. Like there's a few levels where you're in Skyworld, and a few where you're in a DK jungle complete with barrels, and those are pretty great, but the majority of it consists of sand dunes and lava pits, and it's all just a bit unexciting. Though there are more exceptions, like boss fights against freaking Ridley, and I actually really dig this ice climber level. Seeing the mountain scale with your ascent gives you a great sense of progress. It's great to see all these Nintendo characters come together, but they don't really bring their worlds with them. They've all come together to face a unified threat in unified locales, and that could probably be pulled off pretty well, but Subspace just doesn't take it far enough. This 10-hour game basically spans 6 settings, and these get repeated over and over with slight variants. And then the gameplay itself kinda shows why Smash is designed the way it is. Look at Mario, look at Sonic, look at Donkey Kong, look at Super Meat Boy. Basically look at any critically acclaimed 2D platformer. What do they all have in common? One jump. Some have mid-air maneuvers like Rayman with his helicopter hair, or Mario finding a temporal power-up. But as a basis, the best platformers tend to only allow one jump, and they do their best to make that jump as satisfying as possible. Because when you have multiple jumps, all of a sudden you can correct your mistakes, and it undermines the calculation process of momentum. And I think momentum is one of the key parts of what makes platforming fun. Smash has a double jump, and it has a third jump. Now in the general gameplay, this works, it's not a traditional platformer. You battle on small platforms, so you need small jumps, but you also need to recover, so you need big jumps. Sometimes a double jump or even a triple jump does work. And hey, look at Kirby, that guy can jump for days! Actually yeah, go back to Kirby. The level design of Kirby and the level design of Subspace Emissary are remarkably similar, and that's because Kirby, much like Subspace, is kind of a brawler rather than a platformer. And so Brawl will often do what Melee's adventure mode does and what Kirby does, and sometimes lock the screen at certain points as you deal with a fight. Smash is a fighting game after all. The main difference though, and the main reason I find Subspace inconsistent with the rest of the game, is almost every fight is a stamina one. Sometimes the enemy AI will be silly and just walk off the stage, but a lot of enemies don't even flinch when you hit them. You have to slowly smack them one by one as their health depletes. That or you just get tired and run away when you can. It's something I think Smash usually does very well. Board the Platforms is about teaching you the moving mechanics. The trophy minigame in Melee is all about launching, but in Subspace, base gameplay isn't that transferable. But at least it gives you one-on-one time with pretty much every character in the game, which is something the series hasn't really encouraged since. It's all about characters after all. Subspace is the easiest way of unlocking them, as once you play as them in the story, you can play as them in any mode. So the stakes to keep playing Subspace are pretty high. Speaking of characters though, Kirby games revolve around Kirby, obviously. He can get multiple different powers, but he's always able to essentially fly. But Smash has over 30 characters to juggle, so while all these battle sequences are great, not every character or setup is as great for platforming. Like, it feels wrong to mess up a barrel fire but then just double jump back into it. It feels bad to bypass entire platforming sections entirely because a character can. Subspace undermines its core principles a lot, and while levels built for Meta Knight won't feature long platforming sections because Meta Knight can just fly, they end up feeling the most repetitive of them all. They're just constant battles against the same enemies. The simplicity of a Goomba is that you can defeat it instantly. I can kill Goombas all day. But when you throw in enemies that take multiple hits, some dozens, and repeat them throughout the entire game, it starts to get grating. Especially if their designs aren't too great to begin with. Like, I hate this bucket guy. He's really annoying if your character isn't really an aerial type. Likewise, this thing isn't tough. It just takes a while to defeat, and that gets tiresome when they keep showing up. Reusing assets is a tough balance, because usually, it's not bad. Absolutely reuse familiar enemies if they're quick to dispose of. But there's a reason Mario 64 has a pit of Bob-Ombs and not a pit of King Bob-Ombs. King Bob-Omb is great, but he's better as a one-off. Subspace doesn't always seem to grasp that. Some of my favourite platforming levels in Subspace are ones with Goombas and Koopas, simply because they're more fun to encounter than swarms of Subspace enemies. Stopping to unleash a flurry of moves kinda ruins the flow of levels, whereas in Kirby, every enemy is also an opportunity, not just a gate. Subspace is an ambitious mishmash of things that work, and things that a fighting game just doesn't do well. We remember the best parts, like these amazing cutscenes that bring all our favourite Nintendo franchises together, but we forget the lesser ones, like Pokemon Trainer needing to double check that the giant orange dragon is in fact Charizard and not Ivysaur, and that's frankly hilarious. We remember flying through Skyworld and hearing those beautiful musical pieces, but we forget that most of the levels are generic and a little boring. It's actually kind of a success. I don't think Subspace is great all around, but despite spending hundreds of hours fighting in Brawl, it's the adventure mode that comes to mind as its identity. Smash 4 on the other hand is possibly a better game, but it's also iterative and safe, unless you really like Smash 4. The single player segments of a fighter are immensely important, as they not only give people without friends nearby a way to play, but they also serve as a tutorial. All of those little breathers in Smash 64 and Melee did something to help you master the game. Break the targets particularly is ingenious. I think Subspace is a little loose with the rules of Smash, as you barely have to launch anyone, but it gives you good hands-on time with every single character, except Toon Link, Wolf and Jigglypuff. Brawl did so much. It doubled down on the multiplayer aspect of Smash and allowed everything to be played in co-op. It had challenges to get you playing in unique ways, all with meaningful rewards. And it was the first Smash to be playable online, though online being disabled nowadays doesn't feel too different to when it was active. Online was pretty much like this. But the fact we could play Smash Online was already a massive step. So yeah, Brawl does stumble in a few areas, but for its time, it was not only the most consistent game in the series, but it had so many things to do, and kept giving the player more and more for doing so, whether they're new stages, new music, new trophies, or new masterpieces. I think what I like the most about Brawl is it's still unique. It doesn't feel like the original, and it certainly doesn't feel like Melee. Smash 4 is also different, but it's also kinda like the in-between title. In fact, a few years from now, I think Smash 4 is going to be the most forgotten title in the series. It's the transition between Brawl and Ultimate, and doesn't do all that much to stand out. Mechanically, it's more defensive, whereas Ultimate is more offensive, but I'm not sure that's enough to build a standing legacy. Brawl's not perfect, in fact it does a lot of things poorly, but you can still very easily plug in a Wii and play like it's 2008. It's not for everyone, but I absolutely think it still holds up today. It's still one of the best Smash games to play with friends who don't typically play games. Yeah, it was the first Smash to have a few cuts like Pichu, Mewtwo and Roy, but in their place are some of the most unique characters to enter the series, like Snake and his arsenal of weapons, and Lucario, who gets stronger as he takes more damage. Brawl absolutely has a legacy, and it's more than just tripping. Though yeah, there's a reason tripping hasn't returned. On a personal note, I think Brawl's one of the most appealing Smash games. I think the roster feels great, it constantly rewards you with ways to keep playing, and it had enough content to keep you busy throughout the entirety of the Wii's lifespan, and beyond. Some simply don't like the lack of focus on competitive fighting, and that's absolutely valid. We all enjoy Smash games for different reasons, and while some see Brawl as the worst, I think it's up there with the best. But what do you guys think about Super Smash Bros. Brawl? Do you still play it today, or has it been replaced? Let us know in the comments below, and of course be sure to subscribe to GameXplain for a lot more from under the Super Scope, and other things gaming too. Until next time, bye.